What if I want to?
If you have questions, I would be happy to hear them. All right.
What if I take 10 minutes to ask a question?
No, do not do that. Okay, I'm starting the presentation.
Okay.
Hello, Professor K. I'm going to be doing my presentation on the Sumerian Proverbs. My friend is here and one more might join just to help it feel more like a presentation, but they did not help me with my project at all. And here it is, Issues in Understanding the Sumerian Proverbs. So first, let's hear some Sumerian proverbs. Here's one. We are doomed to die, let us spend. We will live long, let us save. You can have a lord, you can have a king, but the man to fear is the tax collector. The storehouse is built for the lizard. Now, these first two come from my textbook and is the only time during this presentation where I cite my textbook. And the last one, I found this one most interesting because when I lived in India, a problem we would have is anywhere where it's dark or cold, lizards would show up. So I feel like this is kind of tapping into that idea of never being able to get rid of the lizards, which I don't think we experience so much here in Western society, but it's something that happened to me in India. Here's my thesis. The difficulties in interpreting Sumerian proverbs and thus understanding Sumerian civilization are multivariable, but deeply rooted in the method these texts were created. 1. These texts' original use was educational exercises rather than compositional completion, leading to a lack of context or tonal information. 2. There is a high variation in the same proverbs because they were transcribed from memory. Now, let's start to unpack that. And this is just a public domain image. This is something what the researchers might be looking at, cuneiforms. Here's something like an example of a tablet they might find. So first, where? Let's give a little bit of context to the discovery itself. So the Sumeria is in the Near East, and particularly where a significant amount of these tablets were found, where is in a place called Nippur. And there's literally thousands and thousands of these tablets, and many of them have just recently been translated and such. And they come in sometimes in certain groupings. So for example, we know there's one grouping during one historical period where they're all very similar. They don't vary, they don't switch around from each other very much. And perhaps later during this presentation, we might see why that might be. And one of the original excavators, a man named Hilprecht, as soon as he started doing this, even he himself acknowledged that that there was some kind of a temple school going on. So even from the origins of this discovery, it was understood that there's some kind of educational aspect to what was going on. So issues with what we don't have. What we don't have is context. What we don't have is tone. And why do I highlight tone here? Well, it's as one writer, Ulster, notes that without knowing that how they were used in everyday life, we can't even be sure to call them proverbs. So there's one problem there. Another writer, Professor Jacobson, notes that these texts particularly have an especially large dependence on context, partially due to how many of them use irony, right? And with irony, there's a saying, but if it's ironic, it goes the opposite way. So one example would be there's a proverb that goes something along the lines of, if you see a weak, sick man, don't give him a cane, because God will help. So we can say that's unironic, and maybe that's something about God helps those who help themselves. You got to pray or you got to do it yourself. But if you put irony on it, it's like, of course we must help people. God isn't dropping canes from heaven, right? There's one example. Some of them are rhetorical questions, and of course we need to know tone, or whether to understand if it's a rhetorical question or not, or it's literal. And many of them are metaphors. For example, there's one that goes something along the lines of, a fox pees into the sea and says, all the sea is now my urine. We don't quite understand what's that supposed to mean, because again, the lack of the context. Now, I don't want to make it seem like all of them are this way. Some of them are very, very explicit. Now, why? Why are they like this? These are such important historical documents. So why no context? Well, they're important historical documents to us. To them, they were just exercises in literacy, in learning to read, well, in learning to write. So, for example, a modern day comparison is when we were all learning to write for the first time. We might have written the saying, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. Now, we can even imagine that as a proverb in itself. We could be like, oh, if you're lazy, you don't do anything, but like the people who are energetic and work hard will rise above the lazy people, right? So because of this, there was no need to correct things if things were mistaken, right? It was a learning process, and there was no goal of preservation at all. So for these reasons, for the lack of context, the lack of tone, due to these not being important documents to these people, is one of the major issues in trying to understand these proverbs, and additionally trying to understand Sumerian civilization. Now, problems with the things we do have. For many of the proverbs, we have a low sample size. Ideally, we'd want several primary documents referring to the same thing, but a proverb might appear once or twice. Now, there are many that appear up to 30 times, but for many, there's a low sample size. So if there's a mistake in one, we don't know if that's a mistake or if the proverb is meant to be that way. And additionally, there's acceptable variation. Now, what do I mean by this acceptable variation? A modern day example might be, today, the phrases, I couldn't care less and I could care less are used in the same ways, and they sort of mean the same things, even though word for word, it's the opposite, right? So there's certain acceptable variations in our modern language today, different ways to say the same thing. And there was acceptable variation back then in that it wasn't the expectation that every document everywhere would be, if it's the same document, an exact replica. They'd understand, oh, there'd be some mixing up. Maybe you'd use some synonyms here and there. So that's a problem with what we do have. We can't separate the acceptable variation from erroneous variation. And what is this erroneous variation? Here, I heavily depend on the researcher of one writer, Del Nero, who did this fantastic paper looking at what kind of mistakes are made in the Proverbs exactly. Are they mistakes towards the middle of a passage, the start of a passage, the ending of a passage? And now the mistakes are so many, and there's no time to recount them all here now today. But what the patterns discovered was that the types of mistakes made are the types of mistakes that are made when a person doesn't fully remember the thing, the text being transcribed. So there was this discussion of whether these transcriptions are coming from a master tablet, because they're all transcribing while they're trying to learn, or is a man reading these proverbs out to them and then they're writing it? Or do they have these passages memorized and now they're trying to transcribe what they have memorized? Well, I've already given the answer. It is memory, and there is substantial evidence for this. Research was done where large passages were memorized, and it was checked like what people forgot first and what kind of mistakes did they make. Additionally, there was a very, very rushed BBC series about, I believe, Shakespeare's life work, right? So the actors only had 6 weeks to memorize all the plays, and they also didn't have the budget to reshoot certain scenes again and again. So just looking at this whole series of Shakespeare's works, we can see the types of mistakes made when something is poorly memorized, and there's very, very strong evidence for those same types of mistakes being made in the Proverbs. Additionally, we can kind of recognize that like one of the scribes wasn't such a good scribe. He really didn't have a grasp of the material, because consistently in his work, there's mistakes again and again and again and again. And if you're like transcribing from a physical copy, then this kind of mistake is absurd to think that you can make this type of mistake again and again and again and again when you're coming from the same master tablet. So there we have issues with the things we do have. We have low sample size for many of the Proverbs. Some of these written things contain acceptable amounts of variation, and there's, of course, erroneous variation. And finally, something I didn't even list here is there's certain truncation of some of the Proverbs. Like you might just have the first half of it. An example of that might be today I might say, you never know until it's gone, right? But that could be truncated to something smaller, like, or the full phrase would be, you never knew you loved it until it was gone, but you can truncate it to, you never knew until it was gone. So those are some of the problems that exist there. This is my bibliography. And finally, any questions? So Marvin, you're the only one who came today. If you do have any questions, please let me know. I am running low on time, but.
No questions. Great job.
Really? All right. Thank you very much. Well, Professor K, that is my presentation right there. And I'll be sending it to you right now.